In 1901, a British socialite named William Knox D'Arcy sat across a table from the Shah of Persia and signed a piece of paper. That paper gave D'Arcy, a man who made his money in an Australian gold mine, the exclusive right to find, extract, and sell every drop of oil beneath Persian soil. For 60 years. Across 480,000 square miles, roughly 80% of the entire country, Iran received $20,000 in cash, shares of equivalent value, and a promise of 16% of future profits, with no right to audit the books. The company that came out of that concession, eventually renamed British Petroleum, which today we call BP, would go on to fuel the Royal Navy through 2 world wars, run Britain's economy on cheap Iranian oil for 50 years, and generate profits that the British government itself taxed at a higher rate than it paid Iran in royalties. By 1948, Britain was collecting more from Iranian oil in taxes than Iran was receiving in the payments that were supposed to be its share. That is the opening number. And that number is the reason everything that came after, the revolution, the hostage crisis, the nuclear program, the war currently running right now, that number is why it all happened. Everything I am about to tell you traces back to that contract. Follow the money. That is always the instruction. Let me give you the production numbers because they tell the story more clearly than any political history. In 1950, Iranian oil production was running at 664,000 barrels per day. That oil was powering British industry, British transport, British military capacity. The world's largest refinery at that point was at Abadan on the Persian Gulf, built on Iranian soil, run by British management, with Iranian workers in the lower-paid positions and British staff in every senior role. Iranian workers at Abadan did not have the same canteen as British workers. The housing was segregated, and Iran was receiving, by most estimates, 8 cents on every dollar of value its oil was generating. In 1951, an Iranian politician named Mohammad Mossadegh became prime minister on one platform: we are taking our oil back. Parliament voted to nationalize the Anglo-Iranian oil company. The vote was unanimous. Mossadegh told the British management to leave. They left. And Iran's oil fields fell silent almost immediately, because Britain did something immediately that the history books tend to underplay. Britain called every oil company in the world and told them, if you buy Iranian oil, we will consider it theft of British property, and we will pursue you under international law. Britain blockaded the port at Abadan, froze Iran's hard currency accounts in British banks, and simultaneously, BP and the Arabian-American Oil Company, Aramco, increased production in Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, and Iraq to replace every barrel Iran was no longer selling. The result: Iran's oil production fell from 664,000 barrels per day in 1950 to 27,000 barrels per day in 1952, from 242 million barrels in a year to 10.6 million. In the first year of nationalization, Iran's only foreign oil sale was 300 barrels to a single Italian merchant ship. 300 barrels. Iran's economy collapsed. Unemployment surged. Inflation destroyed household purchasing power. And then the British, finding they couldn't achieve their objective with economics alone, went to Washington. The ask was specific. The CIA later confirmed it. Madeleine Albright, U.S. Secretary of State, acknowledged it publicly in 2000. Help us remove Mossadegh. The Cold War framing was this: Mossadegh is unstable, the two-day Communist Party is growing in Iran. If Mossadegh falls without Western intervention, a communist regime fills the vacuum, and the Soviet Union gets its hands on the Persian Gulf oil fields. That was the argument. That was the pitch to Eisenhower's administration. The CIA's operation was called Ajax. MI6 called it Boot. The combined operation paid Iranian military and political figures to organize street pressure, funded mobs, staged pro-Shah demonstrations, and worked to peel away Mossadegh's political coalition. On August 19, 1953, the coup succeeded. Mossadegh was arrested, tried, and spent the rest of his life under house arrest. He died in 1967 without ever leaving. The Shah returned. And in 1954, a new oil agreement was signed. this time giving American companies 40% of Iranian oil alongside BP's 40%. Let me stop there for a second, because what just happened financially is the most important thing in this entire story. Before 1953, Britain controlled Iranian oil. America was adjacent. After 1953, America controlled 40% of Iranian oil. The CIA had just bought America into the Persian Gulf energy market at the price of one covert operation. The Cold War framing was the justification. The oil concession was the result. These are not the same thing, and conflating them is how the story gets muddled. Now, something happened after 1954 that nobody who tells the Cold War version of this story bothers to dwell on. Iran's oil production, under the new consortium, recovered. By 1959, it was 951,000 barrels per day, 50% higher than before nationalization. Revenue to Iran improved. The Shah got his country back, modernized it at speed, educated women at rates comparable to Western Europe, built universities, built industry. By 1975, women made up 44% of medical graduates at Tehran University. None of this excuses the 1953 coup. The point is that the 1953 coup is not the straight line to 1979 that the conventional story requires. 26 years is not a short fuse. What happened in 1979 was not a deferred reaction to 1953. It was something that grew inside Iran independently, fueled by different frustrations: the Shah's repression, his secret police, the speed of modernization that left rural and religious communities behind, and the specific political theology of one man, Ayatollah Khomeini. And that is the second financial story inside this history, because Khomeini's argument, the argument that eventually brought 1 million people into the streets of Tehran, was not fundamentally about the CIA in 1953. It was about sovereignty, about who makes the laws, about the proposition that neither a king nor a foreign power nor an elected parliament has the right to govern, that governance belongs to God, and its earthly administration belongs to the scholars of Islamic law. Khomeini had been making this argument since 1963. The Shah had him arrested, then exiled, first to Iraq, then to France. From France, Khomeini's sermons were recorded on cassette tapes and smuggled into Iran. Cassette tapes, the most consequential political distribution infrastructure of the late 1970s, was a cassette tape smuggling network into Iran. By December 1978, the Shah's government was functionally finished. He left the country, officially for medical treatment. He never came back. Khomeini landed at Tehran's Mehrabad airport on February 1, 1979. 4 million people lined the road from the airport to the city. In April 1979, a referendum was held. 98% of votes were cast in favor of an Islamic republic. The financial consequence of that transition was immediate and permanent. The Shah's deal with the Western Oil Consortium was cancelled. The National-Iranian Oil Company took full control of production. Iran's oil exports initially collapsed, from 5.4 million barrels per day before the revolution to under 1 million in the post-revolution chaos. The 8-year war with Iraq that began in 1980 destroyed infrastructure and kept production suppressed throughout the 1980s. Iran did not recover to 4 million barrels per day until 2003. And then the sanctions architecture began layering on top of everything else. Here is where the current situation makes sense financially, rather than ideologically. Iran has the third largest proven oil reserves on Earth, 209 billion barrels. It has among the world's largest natural gas reserves. It sits on the eastern shore of the Strait of Hormuz, through which 20% of global seaborne oil trade and 20% of global LNG supply moves every day. As a fully integrated global oil and gas exporter, a sanctions-free Iran would put 3 to 4 million additional barrels per day into global markets and become a serious competitor to Saudi Arabia for regional energy dominance. From Riyadh's perspective, that cannot be allowed to happen. From Washington's perspective, an independent Iran that controls its own oil revenue, maintains a nuclear enrichment program, operates a network of proxy forces through Hezbollah, Hamas, and the Houthis, and sits beside the world's most critical energy choke point, that Iran is a direct threat to the petrodollar architecture that the 1974 agreement with Saudi Arabia built, and that the United States has defended for 50 years. This is not about nuclear weapons. The IAEA Director General said explicitly, 2 days before the bombs fell on Tehran on February 28, 2026, that his organization did not see a structured program to manufacture nuclear weapons in Iran. 2 days before the war started. That statement was made on American television. The nuclear framing is what makes the war legible as a security decision. The financial architecture is what makes it legible as a strategic one. Iran with nuclear weapons is a problem for Israel. Iran without sanctions, selling 4 million barrels a day into global markets, building LNG export capacity through its massive South Pars gas field, the largest gas field in the world, shared with Qatar. That is a problem for the entire petrodollar system. It is a problem for Saudi Arabia's ability to manage OPEC pricing. It is a problem for the United States' ability to use energy market leverage as a foreign policy tool. And it is a problem for every LNG contract that American companies are currently trying to sign with European buyers who are looking for alternatives to Russian gas. 75 years of Iran's financial history reduces to this. Every time Iran has tried to control its own energy resources, a Western power has intervened. 1901, the original concession imposed on a weak monarchy. 1951, nationalization attempted. 1953, coup. 1979, revolution that cut Western companies out completely. 1980, Iraq, with Gulf state and Western backing, attacks Iran in a war that lasts 8 years and destroys its oil infrastructure. Then sanctions. Then more sanctions. Then the nuclear deal that was supposed to lift sanctions. And then the unilateral U.S. withdrawal from that deal in 2018. Then more maximum pressure. Then a Geneva negotiation that was days away from an agreement in February 2026 when the bombs started falling. The pattern is not difficult to see once you stop reading it as a security story and start reading it as an energy architecture story. Every intervention has served the same function: keeping Iranian oil off global markets at a price and volume that Iran controls. Iran's strategy, the proxies, the enrichment program, the mining of the Strait of Hormuz, is the mirror image of that pattern. Iran cannot win a conventional military confrontation with the United States. It has known this for 40 years. What it can do is make the cost of containing it high enough that the calculus changes. The Houthis disrupting Red Sea shipping. Hezbollah maintaining a credible deterrent on Israel's northern border. Hamas sustaining pressure in Gaza. The mines in the Strait of Hormuz. None of these individually change the balance of power. Together they are Iran's answer to the financial architecture of containment. If we cannot sell our oil freely, we will make the oil of everyone else more expensive to move. That is not terrorism. That is leverage. It is the same leverage the United States uses when it controls the SWIFT messaging system. The same leverage Britain used when it controlled the telegraph cables in 1914. The same leverage the Dutch used when they controlled the trading routes in the 17th century. Weaponizing infrastructure is what powers do when they have no other option. The difference is that Iran is doing it from a position of weakness, created specifically by the financial architecture of containment. And the architecture of containment was built specifically to prevent Iran from monetizing the third largest oil reserves on Earth. Everything in the Middle East right now, the bombs on Tehran, the mines in the Hormuz Strait, the $92 oil price, the LNG contracts being rewritten in Brussels and Tokyo, everything traces back to a piece of paper signed in 1901 by a British socialite with a taste for adventure and $20,000 in his pocket. That is not an opinion. That is 75 years of documented financial history. And understanding it is the only way to understand what comes after the shooting stops. Welcome to the geopolitics of money.